In 1839, Britain did something unthinkable. They went to war to defend their right to sell drugs. Not just any drugs. Opium. They forced an entire nation to become addicted to it. 40 million people became addicts. Then when China tried to stop them, Britain sent warships. 2 wars. Decades of destruction. All for profit and greed. This is how Britain became the world's largest drug dealer, and made billions doing it. To understand how Britain became a drug dealer, you need to understand their obsession with tea. In the 1700s, Britain was obsessed with tea completely. Every social class drank it daily. It was a national identity symbol. By 1800, Britain imported 30 million pounds of tea annually. The problem was simple and devastating. Tea only grew in China exclusively, and China didn't want anything Britain was selling to them. The Chinese emperor looked at British goods and saw nothing valuable. Wool. China made better silk fabrics. Manufactured goods. China had superior craftsmen. The emperor told British merchants clearly, "We have everything we need here." China in 1800 was the world's largest economy by far. They produced 1/3 of global GDP. Their silk was unmatched in quality. Their porcelain was legendary worldwide. Why would they need British wool? But Britain wanted tea desperately enough, so they paid in silver only. Tons of it every single year. Every year, millions of pounds of silver flowed from Britain to China in endless payments. Britain was hemorrhaging wealth rapidly. By 1800, Britain had a massive trade deficit with China. The British Treasury watched their silver reserves drain year after year. The government panicked about the crisis. They tried everything they could think. Nothing worked to reverse the flow. Then someone had an idea suddenly. A terrible, brilliant idea emerged: opium. China had banned opium in 1729. The Qing emperors knew it was destroying people's lives completely. Addiction was spreading through the population. Productivity was collapsing across the nation. Families were being torn apart violently. The ban was clear and absolute. No opium allowed in China. Violation meant death by execution. But Britain didn't care about Chinese law or sovereignty. They cared about the trade deficit. And they noticed something important. Despite the ban, Chinese people would pay anything for opium. The demand was already there underground. Opium dens existed secretly and illegally. Smugglers were making fortunes from it. All Britain had to do was supply it at scale. With British efficiency and the East India Company's vast resources, they could flood China with opium. Here's how the operation worked systematically. The East India Company controlled vast territories in India completely. The same company that ruled India for profit and extraction. Bengal, Bihar, and parts of central India were under control. Millions of acres of farmland. They forced Indian farmers to grow opium poppies exclusively. Fields and fields of them everywhere. Farmers had no choice in this. The company mandated which crops they grew on their land. If you owned land in certain districts, you grew opium, or you lost your land completely. The raw opium was sent to company factories in Patna and Banaras for processing. There, workers processed it into dense cakes for smoking, refined it, made it smokable. Each cake weighed about 3 pounds. Workers packed them into wooden chests. Each chest held roughly 140 pounds. 40 cakes per chest exactly. Then the chests were shipped to Calcutta for auction. But there was a problem here. The British government officially banned the opium trade to avoid diplomatic issues with China. Parliament didn't want the embarrassment of openly selling drugs. So the East India Company created a loophole cleverly. A brilliant, cynical loophole emerged. They held public auctions in Calcutta. Private merchants would buy the opium. Independent businessmen supposedly. Free traders operating independently. Not officially connected to the company. Then these, independent traders, would smuggle it into China illegally. The British government could claim innocence. We don't sell opium to China. Private merchants do that independently. We can't control private enterprise. That's free market capitalism working. It was a complete lie obviously. Everyone knew the East India Company coordinated everything behind scenes. The company grew the opium crops, processed it in their factories, auctioned it to chosen merchants, financed the ships for transport, protected the smugglers with naval escorts. The private merchants were just middlemen in a coordinated operation. But the system worked perfectly well. Britain got to claim moral distance, while making massive profits from drugs. Meanwhile, the opium flooded into China. The smuggling operation was sophisticated and massive. Massive ships called opium clippers sailed from India to China. They couldn't enter Chinese ports legally. Opium was banned by Chinese law. So they anchored just offshore. Just outside Chinese territorial waters carefully, these became floating warehouses permanently. Chinese middlemen called fast crabs used small, fast boats instead. They'd row out to the ships at night under cover, load up opium into their boats, row back before dawn broke, then transport it inland through networks of corrupt officials. Local Chinese authorities were supposed to stop this illegal trade, but many were bribed generously. Others were addicted themselves already. Some simply looked the other way. The operation was massive and sophisticated. By 1820, the British were shipping 5,000 chests yearly. By 1830, 20,000 chests yearly. Each chest held 140 pounds exactly. That's 2.8 million pounds of opium, every single year flowing into China. The numbers were staggering and growing. The numbers were staggering and growing exponentially year after year. And it worked perfectly for Britain. Silver that had been flowing from Britain to China suddenly reversed direction completely. Now Chinese silver flowed to Britain. The trade deficit disappeared entirely. Britain was balancing their books by destroying Chinese society deliberately. The profits were enormous and increasing. A chest of opium cost the company about 250 rupees to produce in India. They sold it at auction for 1,200 to 2,400 rupees. That's a 400 to 900% markup on drugs, just on the company's end alone. The private merchants then sold it in China for even more. Everyone in the chain got rich, except the Chinese farmers forced to grow it against will, and the Chinese people who became addicted to it. By 1835, estimates suggest 12 million Chinese people were addicted, 12 million out of 400 million. In a country of roughly 400 million, that's 3%, but concentrated heavily among adult men. Government officials were addicted now. Soldiers were addicted to opium. Merchants were addicted as well. Entire villages were addicted together. Productivity collapsed across the nation. Chinese families spent their savings on opium instead of food. Men stopped working the fields. Farms fell into disrepair everywhere. The Chinese economy started hemorrhaging silver just like Britain before. The tables had completely turned around. The Qing Emperor watched his empire crumble before his eyes. Tax revenues fell year after year. Military readiness declined drastically. Social order fractured in cities. He knew the source clearly. British opium was destroying China. Something had to be done immediately. In 1839, the Qing Emperor appointed a hardliner to act. Commissioner Lin Zexu was chosen. Lin was 54 years old then. A scholar official with an impeccable reputation for honesty and discipline. Incorruptible, disciplined, absolutely loyal to Emperor. He had a simple mission assigned: stop the opium trade completely, by any means necessary whatsoever. Lin arrived in Canton, the main port for British trade, in March 1839 with authority. He moved fast and decisively. Within days, he arrested over 1,600 Chinese opium dealers personally, confiscated 70,000 opium pipes immediately, seized 43,000 pounds of opium from Chinese merchants in Canton. But that wasn't enough for him. The real source was the British. Lin immediately wrote a letter to Queen Victoria herself. The letter was remarkable and powerful. It was respectful but absolutely firm. Lin appealed to her morality directly. Your country lies 20,000 miles away from China here. You do not allow opium in your own country legally. You know it harms and destroys people's lives completely. Why then do you allow your merchants to bring this poison to China deliberately? Where is your conscience in this? I have heard that smoking opium is strictly forbidden in your own country by law. Why do you let this evil that harms people spread to other countries then? Suppose someone from another country brought opium to England and seduced your people to use it. Would you not be angry then? The letter asked a devastating question. Why is it illegal in Britain but acceptable to sell to China for profit? The letter never reached Queen Victoria. British officials intercepted it immediately. They knew what it said would be embarrassing to government. It exposed the moral bankruptcy of British policy completely. Lin didn't wait for a response. He went straight to the British merchants in Canton directly. He issued an order clearly: surrender all your opium within 3 days or face consequences. The British refused to comply. They claimed the opium belonged to private merchants, not government. Lin didn't care about their legal distinctions at all. He surrounded the foreign warehouses and residences with troops, cut off all food and water, held over 350 foreigners under effective house arrest indefinitely. British merchants, American merchants, and the Chinese employees trapped inside. Nobody in, nobody out allowed. The siege lasted 6 full weeks. Conditions deteriorated rapidly inside. Food ran low quickly. Supplies dwindled day by day. The British merchants realized Lin was serious about his threat. He would let them starve if necessary to get compliance. Finally, they surrendered everything. 20,350 chests. 2.6 million pounds of opium total. Worth $6 million silver dollars at the time in value. That's over $100 million in today's money. Lin didn't sell it for profit. He didn't redistribute it either. He publicly destroyed it completely. He wanted to send a message to China and Britain. This poison has no place here. Not now. Not ever again. Lin supervised the destruction personally daily. Workers dug huge trenches near the ocean for disposal. Each trench was 150 feet long and 7 feet deep. They lined them with stone carefully. Then workers dissolved the opium in water mixed with salt and lime to destroy it. The lime broke down the opium, made it completely useless forever. They flushed it all into the sea in batches. It took 23 days total, from June 3rd to June 25th, 1839 without stopping. Lin stood there and watched every single day personally. Thousands of Chinese gathered to watch. Some cheered the destruction loudly. Others wept, knowing they couldn't get their next fix. The destruction was systematic, thorough, and very public for impact. Lin wanted everyone to see it. The British merchants were outraged completely. They demanded compensation for their losses. 2,300 chests belonged directly to British merchants personally. They claimed it was theft, an act of war against Britain. They sent urgent messages to London exaggerating the situation, claiming British lives were in danger, demanding military intervention from government. The British government saw an opportunity. This wasn't just about opium anymore. They could use this incident to force China open wide. Not just for opium trade, for all British goods and trade. Force China into unequal treaties. Open more ports to trade. Destroy Chinese trade barriers completely. The Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston prepared Britain's response carefully. He didn't care about the moral arguments at all. He cared about British commercial interests and national pride. And British pride and power. A Chinese official had humiliated British merchants in public. That couldn't stand without response. The British government prepared for war. In September 1839 a British fleet was ordered east immediately. The First Opium War was about to begin soon. All because Britain refused to stop selling drugs for profit. In June 1840 Britain sent a naval force to China. 16 warships sailed toward China. 4 armed steamships with paddle wheels. 4,000 soldiers were aboard, plus modern artillery and rockets. China had never seen this before. The steamships could move against the wind and current. To Chinese they seemed supernatural. The Qing military had 800,000 soldiers on paper, but they had outdated weapons. Matchlock muskets from the 1600s. The British had modern rifles accurate at 300 yards. The technological gap was enormous. This wasn't a fair fight. It was a technological massacre. British ships sailed up the coast bombarding Chinese cities. Chinese defenses couldn't reach British ships. City after city fell to them. British steamships destroyed Chinese war junks. One British ship defeated 20 Chinese junks easily. Chinese commanders realized they couldn't win. In 1842, British forces reached Nanjing. British warships positioned outside the city. The Qing Emperor finally understood reality. He couldn't win this war. He sent negotiators to surrender. The Treaty of Nanjing was signed on August 29, 1842. Aboard the British warship HMS Cornwallis. It was one of the most lopsided treaties in history. Here's what China was forced to accept under duress. Pay Britain $21 million silver dollars in reparations total. Open 5 ports to British trade across the coast. Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, Xiamen, and Canton. Cede Hong Kong to Britain forever. Grant British citizens extraterritoriality in China. British people couldn't be tried in Chinese courts at all. British citizens were above Chinese law. Set fixed low tariffs on British goods permanently. China lost sovereignty over trade policy. Notice what's missing from the treaty. The treaty didn't mention opium once. Britain didn't officially legalize it. They just made it impossible to stop the flow. With 5 ports open, opium flooded in faster than ever. By 1850, 50,000 chests per year flowed into China. That's 7 million pounds of opium. Double the pre-war amount shipped. The addiction crisis exploded across China. 1 in 10 Chinese men was addicted by 1850. In some regions 1 in 4. The Chinese economy was devastated completely. China was trapped in a nightmare. Forced to allow the thing destroying their society. In 1856 Britain decided they wanted even more from China. More ports, more access, More control. France joined in this time. The excuse for war was flimsy. Chinese officials boarded a ship called the Arrow in 1856. Britain claimed sovereignty violation despite the registration being expired. France joined because a missionary was executed for illegal proselytizing. Really, both wanted an excuse for more control over China. The Second Opium War was even more brutal than First. British and French forces invaded in 1857 with vengeance. This time they aimed for Beijing itself as target. They captured cities moving north systematically. In 1858 they captured the Taku forts near Beijing. The Qing Emperor fled north immediately. On October 6, 1860, British and French troops entered the Old Summer Palace. It was one of the most beautiful complexes in the world. Built over 150 years with 5 times the Forbidden City's size. Filled with centuries of Chinese art, porcelain, jade, gold, silk paintings, priceless historical artifacts everywhere. British and French troops spent 3 days looting it completely. They stole everything valuable they could carry from the palace. Treasures too large were destroyed out of spite and rage. On October 18, the British commander ordered it burned completely. As punishment for Chinese resistance. It burned for 3 full days. 200 buildings destroyed completely. Centuries of Chinese culture turned to ash and smoke. The destruction was methodical and deliberate. It was cultural terrorism against China. The emperor had no choice left. China surrendered completely to Britain. The Convention of Beijing was signed on October 24, 1860. Even more devastating than before. Here's what China was forced to accept this time. Legalize opium imports officially in law. Not just tolerate it anymore. Make it completely legal everywhere. Open 11 more ports to foreign trade throughout China. Allow foreign diplomats in Beijing with armed guards permanently. Let Christian missionaries operate freely anywhere. Cede more territory beyond Hong Kong. Pay more reparations to both countries. Allow British ships on all Chinese rivers they wanted. China lost control of its own territory and laws. Foreign powers dictated Chinese policy directly. The opium trade exploded after this. By 1880, 13 million pounds of opium yearly into China. Chinese farmers started growing it domestically. The addiction rate peaked around 1890. 40 million Chinese were regular opium users by then. 10% of the entire population. The social and economic damage was catastrophic nationwide. Entire generations lost to addiction permanently. The Opium Wars didn't just legalize drugs in China. They shattered China's view of itself as a civilization. For thousands of years, China saw itself as superior, the Middle Kingdom above all. Then 2 wars proved they were helpless against Western technology. Chinese intellectuals called this the century of humiliation. After the Opium Wars, other powers saw China as weak. France took territory from China. Germany took territory from China. Russia took territory from China. Japan took territory from China. China was carved up like a pie among foreigners. Foreign powers controlled Chinese ports and factories directly. The Qing dynasty limped forward but never recovered. In 1912, it finally collapsed. Over 2,000 years of imperial rule ended at last. The Republic inherited a broken nation. Economically devastated by foreign exploitation. Socially fractured by opium addiction. And still dealing with mass addiction everywhere. It wasn't until 1949 that China finally ended the crisis. The communists used brutal methods. Forced rehabilitation camps for addicts, executions of dealers without trial, destruction of poppy fields everywhere. But it worked to end it. By 1960, opium use was nearly eradicated completely. But the damage lasted generations. Meanwhile, Britain got rich from the trade that destroyed China. The opium trade made British merchants millionaires overnight. The families that ran the trade became Britain's elite. Jardine Matheson, Dent and Company. These trading houses became respectable corporations over the years. They still exist today worldwide. Jardine Matheson is now a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. Their fortune was built on opium. Hong Kong, seized during the First Opium War, became a British colony for 156 years. It returned to China in 1997. Britain held their opium prize until the 21st century. The Opium Wars were not about free trade at all. They were about Britain forcing China to accept a product that destroyed millions of lives. All to fix a trade deficit. Britain claimed they brought civilization to Asia. But they brought addiction, war, and exploitation instead. Between 1820 and 1920, an estimated 40 to 100 million Chinese people used opium. Millions died from addiction-related causes. China's economy was drained of silver. Its government was humiliated internationally. Its territory was carved up by foreign powers. All because Britain needed to balance their trade books. The irony is striking today. Today, the opioid crisis in America and Britain kills tens of thousands every year. The same countries that forced opium on China now struggle with their own addiction epidemics. History doesn't repeat exactly ever, but it rhymes eerily sometimes. The Opium Wars proved something dark about empires. When profit is the only priority, there are no moral lines. Britain didn't care that opium destroyed Chinese families completely. They cared that tea was expensive. For 2 centuries China called this the century of humiliation, and they remember it still today.